Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to the Chicago Humanities Festival to talk about my new book, Gods and Robots, Myths, Machines, and Ancient Dreams of Technology. So who first imagined robots, replicants, and automatons? Most people assume that the first self-moving machines and animated statues were invented in the Middle Ages. But was it possible, I wondered, was it possible that the idea, the concepts of automatons could have appeared much earlier? Could people in antiquity have imagined such things before technology made them possible? It turns out that more than 2,500 years ago, some vivid Greek myths envisioned how one could fabricate artificial life, robots, and self-moving animated statues using biotechne. And those are the ancient Greek words for life through craft. In other words, what we now call biotechnology. So long before technological innovations made self-moving devices possible, ideas, concepts about creating artificial life were being explored in ancient thought experiments. Basically, these Greek myths were some of the first ever science fiction tales. The mythical artificial replicas were described as made, not born. That is, they were manufactured, not born biologically. And that phrase, made, not born, defines a crucial definition. It's a distinction between what's natural and unnatural, biological and artificial, human and non-human. These were not just lifeless objects or inert matter brought to life by a magical spell or a command by a god. These were synthetic beings, and they were imagined as products of technology. They were made by gods using familiar tools and materials of the day, but because the makers were gods, they achieved awesome results. And these marvelous automatons of myth appeared in stories about Jason and the Argonauts, who battled bronze robots, the fire-bringer Prometheus, and Pandora, the female android created by Hephaestus, the god of invention. The theme of this year's festival is graphic, so I thought we would concentrate on classical Greek illustrations of automatons from 2,500 years ago, just to see how artists of that time portrayed the very earliest images of robots and replicants. These myths had thrilled listeners since antiquity, right up to the present day, so I'm also going to include some modern illustrations of these myths, along with the ancient ones, and I think it's fascinating to trace just how pictures of ancient automatons have evolved over the millennia from classical Greece through the Middle Ages right up to films and graphic arts today. So at the end of my talk, we'll look at some modern fantasy art that envisions the theme of ancient robots from lost civilizations. Well, let's start with the very first robot to walk the earth, and I'm talking about mythology, of course, and that is Talos. He was a giant bronze automaton made by the god of invention and technology, Hephaestus. This myth is really ancient, first written down in about 750, 700 BC. Talos was a killer robot. He defended King Minos' kingdom of Crete from invaders and pirates. Talos was self-moving. He marched around the large island 3 times a day, and he was programmed to spot invaders and then pick up and hurl boulders to sink approaching ships. And there are ancient coins from Crete that show Talos throwing rocks. It's another coin showing Talos. This is made in about 350 BC. And I'll just note that on the other side of this coin with Talos, it's another guardian that helped to defend Crete. That was the golden wonder dog named Lelaps. He was an artificial hound that never lost its prey. Like Talos, the golden hound was made by Hephaestus. It's interesting that this is an ancient vase painting of the golden wonder dog, and this is a modern impression of Lelaps, the robot dog. Now going back to Talos, Talos in close combat, he could heat his bronze body to red hot, and then he would grab up victims and crush them to his chest. He roasted them alive that way. And this Etruscan mirror shows that capability, made in about 450 BC. The inner workings of the bronze android confirmed his technological origins. According to the myth, Talos had a single tube or artery running from his head to his toe. Now, instead of blood, ichor pulsed in that tube or artery. So Talos was thought of as a machine powered by ichor. Ichor was the mysterious fluid of the gods. Talos' entire vivisystem, you might call it, was sealed with a bronze nail or bolt on his ankle. And Jason and the Argonauts in the ancient epic encountered Talos on their quest for the golden fleece. Now, many of you may be familiar with Talos if you are fans of what is now a cult movie, Jason and the Argonauts from 1963. It was a film featuring the unforgettable stop-motion animation figures and scenes created by Ray Harryhausen. In the ancient myth, Jason and the Argonauts were doomed to become the victims of Talos when they landed on Crete. This vase is from the 5th century BC, showing Talos as a bronze man. And here you can see how the artist portrayed him made of metal. You can see the same technique for painting a bronze suit of armor on the other side. Jason and his men were saved by the witch Medea. It was Medea who actually figured out how to destroy that bronze robot, and she used a combination of persuasion and technology. She convinced Talos that she could make him immortal. She could make him immortal, she promised, but only if he allowed her to remove that bronze bolt on his ankle. Talos agreed to that, and Medea and Jason unsealed the bolt so that his power fluid, the ichor, would bleed out. Ancient vase paintings made in the 5th century BC showed Jason using a tool to remove that bolt. So Talos was made with technology and he was destroyed with technology. In the myth, the bronze robot's ichor flowed out like molten lead. He toppled over and collapsed. Ancient Greek plays and artworks about Talos in antiquity depicted him as a metallic robot, but with human-like features. He was a sort of a cyborg-like being, and in other words, a sort of machine-human hybrid. The techno-wizard Medea, she was able to guess that Talos had human-like desires and that he feared death. He wished to be immortal. And Talos could be persuaded and fooled by Medea, and that's another human feature of this robot. Well, today psychologists try to understand why we tend to anthropomorphize robots, why we feel empathy for them. We seem to be sort of hardwired to bestow emotions and feelings on things that somehow seem alive, especially if they have a name and a backstory. Some of you might remember the famous Stanley Kubrick movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, made in 1968. And the iconic scene from that movie, the computer Hal seems most human when he's being deactivated, when he's being destroyed by the astronaut. Hal tells his name and he recites what he thinks are memories from his childhood. In the film Jason and the Argonauts, despite the expressionless face of the bronze automaton, the astonishing animation sequence somehow manages to suggest glimmers of personality and sort of intellect in Talos. So he's portrayed sympathetically in that poignant scene as his life fluid bleeds out. The great robot struggles to breathe. He clutches his throat as his bronze body sort of cracks and crumbles. The modern audience feels pity for the helpless giant, and the human qualities are what make the robot's destruction feel tragic. As in antiquity, the people today feel sympathy for the robot who was tricked and killed while he was just going about simply doing his job. In this ancient vase painting of Talos made 2,500 years ago, the dying Talos is shown as a large man of bronze. He's sort of swooning or fainting, falling backwards as Jason removes that bolt on his ankle. The artist even painted a teardrop falling from the robot's eye. Metal automatons cast in human form, like Talos, they captured the imagination of artists in the Middle Ages. In a medieval painting from about 1350, we see Alexander the Great fighting two golden robots who are guarding a bridge. That's in the upper left of the slide. The medieval knight Sir Lancelot also battled copper robots that were guarding castles. And here are some more medieval robots, and there's even one designed by Leonardo da Vinci. The mythic figure of Talos inspired the medieval poet Edmund Spenser in his epic poem, The Faerie Queen. Written in 1596, Talos was retooled as the Iron Knight, who was also called Talos. The Iron Knight was a relentless killer robot without mercy. The story of Talos has enchanted modern artists too. We have a wealth of illustrations of the mythic encounter between Jason the Argonauts and Talos. And these are a few examples of modern artists' ideas of that encounter. Now, one might ask what inspired the ancient mythographers and artists who first described and illustrated the Talos story. One influence, I think, might have come from the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, near Italy. Recently, archaeologists there have excavated about 40 colossal stone statues on Sardinia. They were made in about 900 to 600 BC, and this kingdom did have close ties with the island of Crete. Some Greek writers reported that Talos had originally defended Sardinia before he came to protect Crete. Archaeologists believe that these strange, towering statues were meant to guard the island against foes. They were protective spirits. So they played a sort of similar role as the bronze automaton Talos did on Crete. And it's possible that these giant stone guardians might have influenced the Greek story of Talos. And these enigmatic stone statues of Sardinia, they have a very distinctive facial features. They have simple discs for eyes and a small slot for a mouth. I think it's easy to see why some people jokingly compare the Sardinian statues to modern android robots from Star Wars. Another possible ancient influence on the idea and the image of Talos might be these mysterious seals from the Minoan civilization on Crete. These were made in about 1450 BC, extremely ancient. The seal depicts a giant android figure looming over the top of a city and perhaps meant to be a guardian something like Talos. Well, Talos enjoys a very lively and long afterlife in modern times. So maybe it's not surprising that our own military scientists have been fascinated by the myth of the great bronze robot. In 1958, the first guided missile system was named Talos. The Talos surface-to-air missiles were mounted on ships that patrolled the oceans. And then beginning in 2013, and currently still ongoing, inspired by the ancient Greek myth of the invincible warrior Talos, who was made of the strongest materials of the day, has inspired the Pentagon scientists at Special Ops Command and DARPA to begin to develop a futuristic robotic AI suit of armor for special ops soldiers. And they deliberately, I think this is really interesting, they devised the name Tactical Assault Light Operator Suit so that they could have the initials Talos for the acronym, the Talos suit. Well, to return to the Greek myth of Jason and the Argonauts, the witch Medea also helped Jason overcome many other automatons. And the next one I'm going to talk about took the form of a pair of fire-breathing bulls made of bronze. In order to win the Golden Fleece, Jason had to accomplish a set of impossible tasks. One of those tasks was to subdue a pair of hulking bronze bulls that breathed fire. And they were made by Hephaestus, the god of invention. Jason had to yoke these fire-breathing bronze robo-bulls to a plow. Then he had to plow a field with the bulls and then plant dragon's teeth in the furrows. The dragon's teeth would then instantly sprout an army of invincible warriors programmed to attack Jason and the Argonauts. Jason needed to defeat this multiplying army of android soldiers, and all this had to be done before nightfall in one day. To protect Jason from the bronze bulls and the terrifying armed men that were going to arise from the dragon's teeth, Medea mixed an ultra-powerful drug. She traveled to the mountain where Zeus had chained the Titan Prometheus as punishment for stealing fire to give to humans. According to the myth, Hephaestus forged the drone-like eagle that came like clockwork every day to torment Prometheus by tearing out his liver. Medea went there to gather ichor, the divine life force that was dripping from Prometheus's wounds, and you can see the droplets falling in this ancient vase painting. So Medea used the same life force that powered Talos. This Promethean drug gave Jason superhuman powers, protected him from fire and from swords. The effects were spectacular, but they were only temporary. They just lasted one day. The special drug gave Jason incredible strength and courage. And just quoting the passage from the epic poem, the Argonautica, as the drug began to circulate in his veins, Jason senses terrifying powers entering his body. His arms began to twitch and flex, his hands clenching at his sides. And this is a vase painting on the left showing the rather skinny, kind of a wimp Jason, retrieving the golden fleece with Medea's help, and the drug basically transformed him into the Hulk. Jason exults in the superhuman strength of his limbs, and he begins to stride and leap about, roaring like a wild beast. So Jason now had the physical and mental power to wrangle those bronze robo-bulls, and many modern artists have been captivated by the idea of metallic bulls snorting flames. So here are some modern impressions of that myth. And this one's my favorite. The bulls charged Jason, flames shooting from their nostrils, as though blasted by bellows from a bronze smith's furnace, writes the poet. Impervious to fire, Jason braves the breath of the bulls, and all day long he plows that large field, and he plants the dragon's teeth, and it's nearly dusk when the diabolical men with spears began to spring up out of the field. And this is that horrible crop of automaton soldiers that Jason must cut down before nightfall. The scene of the menacing skeleton soldiers popping out of the ground is probably best known today, once again from the spectacular special effects sequence in that movie Jason and the Argonauts. In the ancient myth, the ghostly giant androids in bronze armor spring up from the soil fully armed. And these artificial soldiers, they couldn't be ordered, no one could lead them. They couldn't retreat, they couldn't halt. They're hardwired to attack. So with continuous reinforcements, these androids advanced on the nearest enemy, which would be Jason and the Argonauts. Medea, once again, to the rescue. Medea figured out how to take advantage of the encoding that was imprinted in this unnatural army. She tells Jason to throw a stone to trigger the soldiers' programming. She realizes that a random impact will start a kind of domino effect, a cascade of blows, and that will cause each android soldier to fight the nearest soldier and thereby destroy each other. So Jason throws a boulder into their midst, and sensing the blows on their bronze armor, the soldiers react as though they've been attacked, and they turn on the nearest soldier. That would be each other. They turn on each other in a frenzy, hacking with their swords, and now Jason and the Argonauts can come in and finish them off and escape. Well, the bronze bulls and Talos were made, as I said, by the god Hephaestus. Hephaestus had an impressive resume of artificial beings, animated statues, and automatons. He was a divine blacksmith, and he was always pictured using the familiar tools and materials that people saw in real foundries and workshops on Earth. But, as I mentioned, because he was a god, the god of invention and technology, his imaginary creations were marvelous, far beyond what any mere mortal blacksmith could achieve, of course. Now, for example, Hephaestus made 20 automated bellows for his forge. According to Homer's Iliad, the automatic bellows blasted more or less air as needed as Hephaestus was working in his forge. Hephaestus also devised a wondrous fleet of self-driving carts that delivered nectar and ambrosia to the gods' banquets and returned to him when they were empty. But his most amazing invention was a crew of life-size, lifelike women made of gold to serve as his personal assistants. Homer, in about 700 BC, describes these golden servants as looking just like real young women. These female androids anticipated the gods' every need, and they were endowed with strength and reason. Even more astonishing, they were equipped with all the knowledge of the gods. In other words, they amounted to a mythological version of artificial intelligence. The capstone of Hephaestus's wonders was another lifelike replicant, one that could interact with mortals on Earth. And in this myth, Zeus commanded Hephaestus to fabricate a beautiful female android to punish humans for accepting fire stolen by Prometheus. And this project resulted in a realistic, artificial woman endowed with human characteristics, especially deceit. This marvelous creation was named Pandora, and there are many ancient vase paintings that illustrate that. Pandora was described by the poet Hesiod, also in about 700 BC, saying that Pandora was an artificial young woman. She was made, not born. This living statue, an artificial intelligence agent in the form of a seductive young woman, was sent to Earth carrying a jar or a box filled with evils. And here's Zeus admiring Pandora before sending her to Earth. Pandora had one mission on Earth, to insinuate herself among humans and open that jar of suffering and misery. And in this vase painting, we can see Pandora in the top row there, standing stiffly like a doll or a statue, and she's got an uncanny smile on her face. Facial expressions are very rare, and so are faces looking straight out at the viewer in vase paintings. So this effect would have been quite startling to people in antiquity. Pandora looks like a wind-up doll about to be set in motion. And she can remind us of another wicked female robot from modern films. I'm thinking of the evil robot Maria in the great silent film Metropolis by Fritz Lang. That was made in 1927, only a few years after the word robot was invented. And I think the ancient images of the female automaton, the femme fatale, being prepared are quite striking. In the Greek myth, Pandora was given as a bride to a man named Epimetheus, who was dazzled by her beauty. Now, Prometheus tried to warn Epimetheus not to accept Pandora. She's no good for you. The myth was romanticized in later European fairy tales. You probably think of Pandora portrayed as an innocent young girl. She couldn't resist opening the forbidden box of troubles. Modern artists love to show Pandora reeling back in horror as the cloud of evils swarm out of the chest. And there are a lot of images of that scene in modern art. But in the original Greek myth, Pandora was not an innocent maiden. She was deliberately created as a beautiful evil, a trap. And what about Hope, the last thing in Pandora's jar? In modern retellings, Hope is often imagined as a kind of kindly fairy to bring comfort to humans. But in classical antiquity, Hope was not a good thing. Blind hope deprives us of the ability to foresee the future. In antiquity, Greek artists depicted Hope as a woman with a crooked smile, a kind of sly smirk on her face. Here she is popping up out of that jar, the last thing in the jar. Prometheus, as we saw, tried to warn against Pandora. He was the Titan who stole fire from the gods to help the first humans, and it was Prometheus who created the first man and woman. An amazing group of ancient artists illustrated this myth in an extraordinary way. They show Prometheus constructing the first human being from scratch as a product of technology. In a series of detailed gems for seals and rings, the Etruscan artists show Prometheus as a kind of engineer. He's using tools to build the first human prototype from the inside out. He begins with a skeleton as the framework, and skeletons are extremely rare in ancient art, so these gems really stand out as a kind of scientific vision of the first humans being engineered piece by piece. And Prometheus is using plumb bobs and hammers and mallets and strings to build the framework first, and then he'll add the muscles and the flesh to the human forms. So he's imagined as making the first human body part by body part. And those images call to mind Mary Shelley's science fiction novel, Frankenstein, I think, about a mad scientist who constructs an android out of human body parts. She wrote her novel in 1818. That was 200 years ago. Did she know about these gems? In fact, engravings of those gems were first published and displayed in Europe just a few years before she was writing that novel. And we know she was influenced by the myth of Prometheus because the subtitle for Frankenstein is A Modern Prometheus. Well, so far we've seen how the very first science fiction tales about making artificial life, automatons, and robots are surprisingly ancient, going back to the myths of classical Greece, first written down in the 8th or 7th century BC. I think these myths show that robots were thinkable long before the technology was available. But now I think I still have a little time to consider how the theme of robots from antiquity appears in some modern artworks. Many examples of what you might call retro-futuristic or future past fantasy art illustrates time-twisting concepts of the idea of ancient automatons. The theme envisions abandoned robots from lost civilizations with advanced technology. The Disney animation WALL-E and the Japanese anime film Laputa, Castle in the Sky are some examples. Two more examples, two imaginary ancient robots, creations of the famous British artist Damien Hirst for his show in Venice last year. The robot on the left is gold-plated, like Hephaestus's gold servants. The vintage-looking robot, encrusted with coral, is meant to look like it was recovered by archaeologists from an ancient shipwreck after millennia on the ocean floor. And these cement or concrete robot-like guardians were built in 1958 in Vientiane, Laos, in Buddha Park. They were deliberately made in 1958 to look like very ancient Hindu and Buddhist guardians. And this is how an artist in Thailand pictured an ancient robotic puppet. This is the figure of a warrior android constructed out of metal scraps from old machines to represent a solitary, reanimated robot that is still patrolling the ruins of a lost civilization. It's another ruined and rusting robot in a painting that shows the robot abandoned on a depopulated shore. And yet another painting of a rusty robot abandoned for eternity in a kind of classical Greek or Roman setting. And I'll just conclude with these haunting images of robots of some future past. I think these modern visions of ancient robots, abandoned robots from some lost world of advanced technology, kind of brings us full circle back to the ways that the ancient Greeks created a whole mythological world of automatons created by awesome but mysterious divine technology more than 2 millennia ago. Fabulous stories and art about the quest for artificial life, beings that are made, not born. They pose timeless questions about what it means to be human. And I think these stories also reveal how imagination always has been and continues to be the spirit that drives myth and science. Thank you. And I'm happy to try and answer some questions if there are any.
Hi, everyone. If you would like the mic, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll have a mic circulating on that side in just a minute, but we will get to all of you. Oh, let's start down here, right in the middle.
Thank you. Hi, in your discussion of, or your reference to Frankenstein in this 200th year of publication, the question I would have is, there are clearly moral implications for man as God creating an image of himself for the future. Were there any such moral implications within the context of the ancients in their creation of these robots?
Well, according to my research, I think that the Greeks were grappling with those same kind of questions, which you can see implied in the myths about creatures that were made, not born. Not one of those ancient myths comes out with a good ending once those beings are sent down to earth, they cause a lot of destruction. It's almost as if the Greek myths are saying, it's great if these things are up in heaven used by the gods, the driverless carts delivering things to their banquets, or automatons helping Hephaestus. But once they're sent down to earth, we get chaos and destruction. So I think that's one implication that they thought they were good to think with and imagine, but maybe not so good to actually have among humans.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, right up here. Kelly will get you.
You were speaking mostly about the Greek myths and mentioned a little bit of some other cultures. I think Talos got in there. Do you see, or would it be worth looking at other cultures, be they Mayan, be they Indian, be they Chinese, et cetera, for similar
Absolutely. I think that's a good,
myths?
that's an excellent question. In my book, I do have examples from ancient India and ancient China, but I think that would be a very rich vein of research to go into. I'd like to do that over the coming year. I know that there's a professor at Washington University in St. Louis who's about to come out with a book on ancient Indian robots. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm talking with some Chinese scholars now to see if we can gather some similar myths and legends and stories from China. So I think that's entirely worth doing, yes.
Great. We've got a question right over there, Kelly. Right there.
So you mentioned Hephaestus as the creator of the automatons. What about Daedalus? Wasn't the Athenian craftsman?
Good question. Daedalus was the legendary brilliant craftsman from Crete who worked for King Minos, who also, of course, had possession of Talos. And I do devote an entire, actually 2 chapters to Daedalus and all of his creations. He was famous for creating animated statues. And the descriptions of the statues that he made that were so realistic. The descriptions in antiquity, in the ancient sources, almost sound like uncanny valley effects in antiquity. So Daedalus is definitely one of the creators on Earth who made animated statues and self-moving devices. Yep.
Right down here in the middle.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. You mentioned that Prometheus in the account created the first human. That first human was a being that was made and not born. Is there something that distinguishes humans then from the robots that you're talking about, like Talos?
And that's a wonderful philosophical question that people have wondered about for a long time. Of course, we're all automatons or artificial beings in some religious sense, I suppose. What's interesting is that there are some Buddhist stories that talk about automatons that fool humans into believing that they're real. And the message at the end of all the ancient Buddhist stories appears to be to remind us that we're all like robots. So that's a really deep question. The epigraph to my book quotes TikTok from John Sladek's novel, and TikTok is an evil robot who says, "I sometimes wonder if robots were invented to answer philosophers' questions."
Great, and we've got a question right in the middle again.
Hi, so I just have a question about the artwork. Is it possible that the artwork of the lost robots could possibly be implying that we lost the originality in the robots that we have today? Because it seems that we're drawing off of the past and how we're creating our robots now.
Do you mean that a lot of our robots seem to look old-fashioned in a way?
They're basically being made off of, like, what I see here is like a lot of mythology. So where's the originality in it? Because it all seems to be something that we've read about or saw in the past.
That's a good question, and we could ask some tech people who are involved in making robots. They do all seem to have a similar look since antiquity, don't they? From cyborgs to robots to automatons, they all do take this similar form. Interesting.
Any other questions? Go ahead and raise your hand. Right up here. Sorry, it's a bit of a hike.
Thank you. Okay. I'm curious now, is there any way to tie in this to the theories of ancient aliens and kind of how they may have looked and maybe have influenced these cultures back then when they were creating these? Has that ever been something that's crossed your mind or path?
Believe it or not, there are some ancient stories about people going to the moon and UFOs. And I know a NASA scientist whose hobby is to find these stories in ancient Greek and Roman texts, and he's written an article about it. I think he uses a pseudonym, though. We don't have any images of what the Greeks and Romans thought aliens looked like, however.
Great. We've got one right over here. Kelly's going to bring the mic right down to you.
You mentioned Prometheus as the builder of the first human, so somewhat of an engineer. I've read one interpretation of Prometheus Bound, and the fire that he gave to humans was actually mathematics and measurement. Did you come across anything close to that reading of Prometheus?
That fire was, could you repeat that?
Was mathematics and measurement.
As time went by, especially in Athenian drama, but the playwrights often like to revise the ancient myths, and by the 4th century, Prometheus was credited with not just the technology of fire, but all of the wonderful things of civilization, so language, mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, language. He was credited with bringing all of civilization to humans, and Athens actually revered him in the Parthenon along with Athena. So I think he just became more and more of a champion of humans. I haven't heard that he was only specifically that fire was specifically related to mathematics, but I'm sure that someone tried to make that connection in antiquity and probably today.
Great. Anyone else? Right over here. Kelly's going to bring it right down to you.
Hi. I do work in robotic automation, and some of the things my company does is we sell carts that drive around to deliver things around, so I thought that was interesting that was in that story. But my question was, for the automatons or anything that was created by these gods, were there ever any stories of those, maybe it's another philosophical question, of those creations themselves creating something else? Were they imbued with that power?
Interesting question about self-reproducing automatons. There aren't any original myths that I know of beings like Talos or Pandora, or even the self-driving carts or the golden servants reproducing themselves. But it's interesting that by the time the Romans get a hold of these stories, people like Ovid, poets like Ovid, who tend to romanticize the stories and retell them, they could not resist saying that Pandora and Epimetheus had children, which of course would have been impossible, and yet he wanted to show how real Pandora had become. It's kind of interesting because it's the same theme that's in Blade Runner 2049, that a replicant could have children.
Great, we've got a question right down here.
Hi, I was really taken with the connections between literature and science, particularly with the Talos figure and then the first missiles and the suits. And I'm wondering if you could say maybe a little more about the connections between those two, and if you think it's really a simple homage to the arts or if there's something else there.
You know, I read the articles about the Talos missiles, the first surface-to-air missiles that were created after World War II. And the scientists were very well educated, and they read Thomas Bulfinch's Greek myths, and they all knew about Talos. And they just, I think, wanted to ground their innovations in Western mythology somehow. And the fact that Talos was made of the strongest materials and the most advanced technology, I think, really inspired them. And it must be the same for the DARPA and SOCOM scientists. Yeah.
We've got a question right up here, all the way up here.
Hi, thank you so much. You are amazing in your knowledge and breadth of information of the ancients and how they relate to modern day heroes, if they will, like the Hulk, that fabulous connection there. But I-Core, going back to the idea of I-Core, the one thing that I heard today that could actually kill a robot, as if we can kill an automaton, right? So are there other things like I-Core that you heard of that would other ways to kill our autonomic?
Well, I-Core was what powered Talos, and Medea in the myth says we know he has I-Core in his body, but we don't know if he's immortal. Let's try. Let's see if he's more human than machine. So you're asking if there are any substances like kryptonite that could that could kill. Actually, I can't think of any right now. What's fascinating to me is that the Talos myth is the oldest story we have about an automaton, and it's the most detailed about his inner workings. Now, a lot of the ancient texts and art has been lost. I mean, a vase curator at the Getty told me that of the thousands of vases that we have in modern collections right now that have survived, that's 1% of what really existed. So much of the literature has disappeared. It's quite possible that some stories of automatons contained more details about their inner workings, but so far, all I've been able to find about inner workings are the details about Talos.
Any other questions? Right down here.
Hi, thank you so much for your chat. I just had a question in terms of robots having the ability to choose. Was there always a notion that they were able to choose what they were doing, or is it something always dictated by the creator? I'm thinking about the difference between human and robots and the ability to choose.
Whether or not the robots could make decisions on their own. Once again, it's interesting in the case of Talos, who was programmed in such a way, if we want to use that modern term, to be able to spot invading ships and strangers, and then to decide to pick up a boulder and throw it at a ship. So he was seems fairly advanced in that he can be aware of his surroundings and then make decisions on what he perceives. So in that particular case of Talos, he definitely has some decisions to make. And then he's able to be, he's persuaded and fooled by Medea, who tells him that she can make him invulnerable and immortal. And he seems to really want that. So he seems to have the emotions that drive him to agree to let her remove that nail. Yeah.
We have time for about 2 more questions if anyone has them. Okay, I'm going to go right up here in the middle.
Hi. We hear references to Homer frequently about being an ancient historian, but other than Homer, are there other people that stand out as being source material, or is a lot of what you know and what we know comes through the art and oral history, or are there other champions of written history that are references in what you've done and what other people have done?
And Homer is probably the oldest source that we have, because he's the one who describes in the Iliad those inventions of Hephaestus. But I also mentioned the poet Hesiod in the Works and Days and in the Theogony, and he wrote around the same time as Homer. And they're writing down what were probably oral traditions that had circulated before they wrote them down. We don't have the authors or the origins of those stories. But then there are a lot of other ancient sources. Apollodorus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Pausanias, Herodotus. Many ancient sources talk about animated statues.
We've got time for one more question, and then afterwards there will be a book signing with Professor Mayor in the lobby on the first floor. Great. One right over there.
So the topic came up about if these automatons could reproduce, and it also came up that in the ancient myths, humans were also created, but humans were able to later on create some automatons. So could that have maybe been the difference that the ancients were trying to show, that humans have the capability to create things, but these really atomic creatures don't?
Yes, that's definitely the distinction that they're making when they use the phrase made, not born. They mean that the beings were created through a kind of biotechne or biotechnology or craft, and that they were not biologically produced like living things, humans and animals. So that all of these beings that are made, not born, they have no parents, they have no childhood, they have no memories, very different from humans. And those same questions, of course, as I mentioned, Blade Runner carries those same themes through in those science fictions. So that is an important distinction between human and non-human. Thank you.